34 days. No body. No suspect in custody. No confirmed sighting. Nothing. An 84-year-old woman vanishes from her home in Tucson, Arizona in the dead of night, and the entire country watches the clock tick while the people trained to find her come up empty, day after day after day. Her name is Nancy Guthrie. Her daughter is one of the most recognized faces on American morning television, and the person who took her planned it, carefully, methodically. They had been to that door before. They knew the layout of the property. They knew she was alone. They even knew her dog was gone. 6 weeks gone. The one living alarm system that might have changed everything. And whoever did this knew it. This is not a random crime. This is not a case of mistaken identity. This is a true crime documentary about a calculated operation carried out against a vulnerable woman in one of the wealthiest, quietest neighborhoods in southern Arizona. And the people responsible have not been caught. Now here's the part that will stay with you. Nancy has a serious heart condition. She depends on daily cardiac medication to function. Without it, according to the sheriff himself, the consequences could become fatal within 24 hours. That statement was made publicly, on the record, over a month ago. And as of today, there's zero confirmed evidence that Nancy has received a single dose of that medication since the night she was taken. Every credible expert who has analyzed this case publicly has looked at those facts, the elapsed time, the medical vulnerability, the silence, and reached the same conclusion.
At the same time, News Nation senior correspondent Brian Enton, who has spent more time on the ground in Tucson than nearly any other national reporter on this case, confirmed a structural change in how the investigation is now organized.
We are going to News Nation senior national correspondent Brian Enton, who is live on the ground in Tucson, Arizona tonight. Brian, tell us the very latest in this, and also what are we hearing about any potential DNA tech issues, mixed DNA?
Day 32 in that search. The Pima County Sheriff's Department says the case has been handed over now to a task force that is operating out of the Tucson FBI office. It includes 5 Pima County homicide detectives, we're told, as well as FBI agents. 88 Crime tells us they have received over 2,300 anonymous tips in reference to this case, and investigators addressing the public today with new information regarding black gloves found about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. In a post on X, PCSD says DNA analysis traced those gloves to a local restaurant employee who is not connected to the case.
A former Nassau County law enforcement lieutenant with decades in the field put her survival odds at under 10% in the early weeks.
It's possible, but the more you get to these kind of rin-tin-tin scenarios, Lassie finding Timmy in the well, the less reliable this evidence is. So I completely agree with you that she's not there. But if law enforcement, which they should be doing, a concentric circle, starting from the blood droplets on the porch, which I'm sure they did, but they should be circling outward, till the point that that whole area was inspected, in my opinion, with a dog. Because humans, it's invaluable. They're doing the right thing. They're walking around looking. What are they looking for?
A woman who survived 9 months of her own captivity and has spent years advocating for the missing said the same thing. That statistically, in cases like this one, the survivable window closes between 24 and 48 hours.
If a person disappears and they're not found within the first 24 to 48 hours, the chances of their survival drop down to almost 0%. I mean, it's almost like they're dead. But I just always feel like we can't give up, because if that was the mentality around my case, then I wouldn't be here today. I mean, I did come back, and there are other victims who do come back. And so even though every passing day feels like we're losing more and more hope, or it seems like it's less likely that she'll be found, I think we just have to remind ourselves that we can never give up. We need everybody's help. We need everyone to keep their eyes open, and that someone will see something, someone does know something. And if we stay alert and we stay aware and we don't just think, oh, well, that seemed kind of strange, but if that really is strange, someone else knows more than me. Don't hesitate. Don't think that. Just pick up the phone, call law enforcement, tell them what you know, tell them what you see.
34 days in, The consensus among outside experts is brutal and is not based on cruelty. It is based on the documented record of what happens in cases exactly like this one. But here's where the story breaks from every assumption you just formed. One man looked at this case and said something different. Not a family member holding on to hope. Not a commentator filling airtime. The Pima County Sheriff. The law enforcement official with direct jurisdiction. The man who has sat inside every classified FBI briefing, who has reviewed the complete DNA analysis, the full pacemaker data, and hundreds of hours of surveillance footage that the public has never seen. Sat down with the national news network on day 31 and said, on camera, on the record, that he personally believes Nancy Guthrie is alive. And then he said 4 more words, words that no one in his position says carelessly. He said his investigators are, quote, definitely closer. That it is the question this documentary is going to answer. Where does that belief come from? What has he seen that the rest of us have not? And is the evidence underneath that statement strong enough to hold the weight of it? Or is it the last thing a man says when he has nothing left to give a family that is watching in him? And sit with that. Because by the time this is over, you will understand exactly why that word, definitely, matters more than anything else said publicly about this case. Let's start with what the investigation actually looks like on the ground right now. Because before we get to what the sheriff said and why it matters, you need to understand what the people running this case are physically doing. Because their actions tell a story that their press conferences do not. Day 33, March 5th. FBI agents returned to Nancy Guthrie's neighborhood in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, and resumed door-to-door canvassing. Not a press conference. Not a public statement. Agents on foot, knocking on the same doors they have already knocked on, and walking the same streets they have already walked. That is not the behavior of a team wrapping up. That is the behavior of a team that has not found what it is looking for, and still believes it can be found. That same week, a formal joint task force was activated. 4 detectives and a sergeant from the Pima County Sheriff's Department were physically relocated, moved out of their own building and into the FBI's Tucson field office, to work the Nancy Guthrie case exclusively. One case, one building, one unified command structure. Sergeant Aaron Cross, president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, confirmed that structure directly. He noted that before this reorganization, nearly the entire detective division of the Pima County Sheriff's Office had been working the case simultaneously. That was never a sustainable model for a department responsible for an entire county. And what the task force does is not shrink the investigation. It concentrates it. It moves it into federal hands and locks it into a permanent and dedicated structure instead of a rotating mass of personnel pulled in different directions. Investigations that believe they are finished do not do that. They wind down. They reassign personnel. They close the command post. What this investigation is doing is the opposite of winding down. That same day, in day 33, Savannah Guthrie walked into Studio 1A at Rockefeller Center in New York City, her first time back inside that building since her mother disappeared. She did not go on air. She went to be with her colleagues. She stood in that studio and told the people around her, I still have hope. I still have hope. And I wanted you to know I'm still standing. Her colleague Hoda Kotb told the audience that morning it was a step forward. NBC confirmed Savannah plans to return to the air but remains focused entirely on the search.
This morning, an emotional return to the Today Show. For the first time since her mother was abducted 33 days ago, Savannah Guthrie stepped foot into Studio 1A, where her Today Show family was waiting with open arms. She hugged every member of the staff and crew, thanking them for the love, for the prayers, and for caring about my mom as much as I do. Going on to say, I wanted you to know that I'm still standing, and I still have hope, and I'm still me. And I don't know what version of me that will be, but it will be. Her colleagues, including her co-host, lined up to show their love and support. Savannah telling the team, I'm holding on to my faith. I still believe. Dylan Dreyer led a group prayer, which began, we're here holding hands as a family, in a place where we don't understand why this is happening. It is not too bold to ask God for the biggest miracles every day. As far as her return to the anchor desk, Savannah says, I have every intention of coming back. I don't know how to come back, but I don't know how not to. You're my family, and I would like to try. Moments later, Jenna and Chanel talked about her visit on their show.
She is beyond loved here. And so we're happy that she is home. I don't know when she's actually returning to the show, but she was here, and that felt so good.
She feels your prayers and your well wishes and all of it, and I think we just keep it going.
Yeah.
We just keep loving her.
34 days in, a new federal task force, a renewed door-to-door sweep. A daughter who traveled to the building she has worked in for years stood inside it and said she still believes. These are not the movements of a family or an investigation that has accepted a conclusion. These are the movements of people who are being told by the people running the case that the search is still active. Because it is. Now let's talk about what everyone outside the investigation is saying. Because dismissing the expert consensus would be intellectually dishonest, and this documentary does not deal in comfort. It deals in what the record actually shows. Nancy Guthrie requires daily cardiac medication to manage a documented heart condition. She also has an implanted pacemaker. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed publicly, early in this investigation, that going without her prescribed medication could become fatal, and that it could become fatal within 24 hours. He said that deliberately, directing the message at whoever was holding her. It was a direct plea. If you want her alive, keep her medicated. That statement was made over a month ago. There has been no confirmed evidence from any source, law enforcement, medical, or otherwise, that Nancy has received her medication at any point since she was taken. Michael Gould is a former Nassau County law enforcement lieutenant and the founder of the NYPD's K-9 unit. He has decades of field experience and has been analyzing the publicly available evidence in this case since the early days. His assessment has not softened with time. He put Nancy's survival odds at under 10% in the early weeks. As of the time this documentary was produced, he has publicly stated his belief that Nancy likely did not survive the first 72 hours. Elizabeth Smart, a woman who survived 9 months of her own captivity after her abduction in 2002 and has since dedicated years to advocating for the missing, addressed this case directly in a podcast interview. She did not hedge, she said, what the research supports. That survival odds in cases like this one fall to near zero after the first 24 to 48 hours pass without recovery. Neither of them is being careless. Neither of them is speaking from a place of cruelty. They are looking at the same public record the rest of us can access. The elapsed time, the medical vulnerability, the absence of any confirmed contact or ransom resolution, and drawing the conclusion that the documented data supports. Their analysis is real. Their expertise is genuine. And here's the single most important distinction in this entire case. The one detail that separates their assessment from the assessment of the man we are about to focus on for the rest of this documentary. Michael Gould and Elizabeth Smart are working from the outside. They can see everything the public can see. They cannot see anything else. Their picture of this case is built entirely from what has been released, reported, and confirmed. That is their boundary, and they have been transparent about it. The man we are about to hear from has no such boundary. None. And what he said, with full access to everything the public has never been shown, is not something that could be filed away as grief or loyalty or institutional pressure to keep a community calm. Not from this particular person, not in this particular role, not at this particular moment in the investigation. Chris Nanos has been the Pima County Sheriff since 2020. He is the law enforcement official with primary jurisdiction over the area where Nancy Guthrie lives. He was present in this investigation from the first phone call on February 1st. He has attended every classified briefing the FBI has conducted on this case. Every single one. He has reviewed the full DNA analysis. Not the summary version described to reporters at press conferences, but the complete laboratory results. He has been briefed on what the pacemaker manufacturer's data revealed when investigators worked, directly with the company to retrieve it. He has access to every frame of surveillance footage collected from the hundreds of cameras in and around Nancy's neighborhood, including footage that has never been made public, that you have never seen, that no journalist has reported on. He knows what the Border Patrol contacts and the Mexican Federal Coordination produced. He has seen what the forensic sweep of the interior of Nancy's home recovered. He has read the contents of every tip among the more than 14,000 submitted to the investigation. Everything the public does not know is in his briefing file. All of it. Every classified result. Every unreleased piece of evidence. The complete picture. On March 2nd, in day 31 of this investigation, he sat down for an interview with NBC News. And he said on camera, on the record, to a national audience that he personally believes Nancy Guthrie is alive. Let that land before we move forward. Not the quote, the situation. This is a law. Enforcement official currently operating under the most intense public and institutional scrutiny of his professional career. A man whose every public statement is being dissected by former federal agents, investigative journalists, true crime analysts, and a national audience that has been watching this case for over a month. A man who's been questioned and criticized for his communication choices throughout this investigation. In the middle of all of that pressure, with all of that scrutiny aimed directly at him, he chose to say that, on camera, not privately, not off the record, to a national news network. People in his position do not make statements like that for comfort. They do not make them to manage a grieving family's emotions. They do not make them because it is the kind thing to say. They make them because they believe them, and they believe them because of what the evidence shows. Not what they hope, not what they wish. What the evidence actually shows. Nanos also confirmed in that same interview that his department's dedicated unit for cases involving death and serious violence is working alongside the FBI on this investigation. And that unit is not operating under a recovery posture. It is not working under the assumption that this case ends with locating remains. It is working under the official operating presumption that Nancy Guthrie is still alive. His exact words. And then he said 4 more words that the true crime community has been analyzing ever since. He said his investigators are, quote, definitely closer. Not probably closer. Not hopefully closer. Definitely closer. Some have pushed back on that specific phrasing. Jennifer Coffindaffer, a former FBI intelligence analyst who spent 13 years inside the Bureau, told Newsweek that the definitely closer language was, in her view, not ideal from a communication strategy standpoint. Her concern was not that Nanos is wrong. Her concern was that language suggesting investigative progress without a specific public ask attached to it could reduce the volume of tips coming in from the public. That is a legitimate critique of messaging strategy. It is not a contradiction of what the underlying evidence supports. And even that communications critique was answered the very next day, when FBI agents were back on foot in the streets of the Catalina foothills, knocking on doors that had already been knocked on, looking for something they had not yet found. You do not return to the same neighborhood with boots on the ground because your sheriff made a poorly worded public statement. You return because the investigation has a specific reason to go back, because something in the evidence picture is pointing you there, because you are still looking for something you believe exists and has not yet been located. That is what active looks like, not a press release, not a candlelight vigil covered by local news agents on foot in the desert heat of southern Arizona on day 33. Now here's what that means when you place it against the full evidentiary picture. The forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, the federal legal framework, and the one piece of classified information that sits at the center of everything and has never been disclosed to the public, because the sheriff did not say what he said in a vacuum. He said it after reviewing something specific, something that the rest of the world, including every expert who has publicly assessed Nancy's survival odds, has never had access to. And that evidence is what the next section of this documentary is about. Let's talk about what has actually been confirmed, not framed by hope, not framed by grief, framed strictly by what has been recovered, what has been analyzed, and most critically, what has not been found. Start with the surveillance footage. On February 10th, the FBI released 6 still images and 3 video clips captured by Nancy Guthrie's front doorbell camera. What those images show is a masked individual dressed in dark clothing, wearing gloves, carrying a 25-liter Ozark trail hiker backpack on Nancy's front porch in the early morning hours of February 1st. After forensic analysis that included FBI investigators erecting a blackout tent at the actual scene to physically replicate the nighttime lighting conditions, the Bureau confirmed the suspect is male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall with an average build. The backpack brand was confirmed through that same controlled process. Investigators examined replica clothing and identical backpack models under simulated low-light conditions to verify precisely what the camera had captured. That backpack is sold exclusively at Walmart as a new item, but Sheriff Nanos has been deliberate about what conclusions that detail does and does not produce. As he pointed out, someone could have purchased it at Walmart and resold it through an online platform before the suspect ever obtained it. Investigators are pursuing that thread through both Walmart's purchase records and through online resale platforms simultaneously. But the backpack is not the most significant thing the footage revealed. Retired FBI supervisory special agent and criminal profiler Jim Clemente analyzed the doorbell footage in careful detail and surfaced something that speaks directly to who this person is. And more importantly, to how this case will eventually be solved. The suspect, Clemente noted, appeared fairly sophisticated in the planning stages of this operation, right up until that doorbell camera caught him. What the footage revealed is that he was not ready for it. He had not anticipated it being there. When he realized the camera was recording him, he stepped outside the vestibule and grabbed nearby brush to try to physically cover the lens. That one improvised, unplanned, reactive motion. That single moment of panic exposed the underside of his right wrist to the camera. And Clemente stated his belief that what is visible in that footage is a tattoo, a marking on the inner right wrist. In any suspect comparison going forward, investigators have that physical identifier to cross-reference, a feature that can rule candidates in or out quickly. But the tattoo is not his most significant mistake. His most significant mistake is far simpler, and it has been hiding in plain sight since day one of this true crime investigation. For all the preparation that he carried out, the mask, the gloves, the dark clothing, the full coverage of his face and hands, he did not cover his mouth. He spent an estimated 41 minutes inside Nancy Guthrie's home without covering his mouth, which means for 41 uninterrupted minutes he was breathing, moving, and exhaling inside an enclosed residential space. His eyebrows, eyelashes, and facial hair, all exposed to the interior environment for the entire duration, all capable of shedding, all capable of having landed somewhere inside that house. Clemente's conclusion on this point was stated without qualification. He said this case will be solved. No uncertainty, no hedging. Because of that footage and because the suspect was not forensically sophisticated enough to prevent his biological material from being left behind at the scene. Now here's what the forensic recovery from inside that home actually produced. Nancy Guthrie's blood was confirmed on the front porch of her residence through DNA analysis. That is documented in public. Mixed DNA was also recovered from the interior of the home. Separately, a pair of gloves was found near the property. Those gloves were submitted for DNA analysis and tested against CODISQS, the FBI's National Criminal DNA database. A match came back. That match pointed to a restaurant employee working in the area near the Guthrie home. Investigators cleared that individual. The connection was coincidental and entirely unrelated to the abduction. That update matters in two directions. It closed a lead, but it also clarified the evidence picture. Because the critical forensic sample in this case is not the exterior gloves. It is the mixed DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home. That interior sample is still under active analysis. Sheriff Nanos confirmed on March 2nd that the mixture appears to contain genetic material from more than one individual, which complicates the processing timeline. But Jennifer Coffindaffer confirmed on record that the sample is potentially eligible for investigative genetic genealogy. This is the same technique that has cracked some of the most significant cold cases in American true crime history, cases that have been sitting open for decades. The process takes months, but if the sample quality is sufficient, it does not dead end. It builds a genealogical profile and traces it back to a family tree, and from that family tree to a specific living person. There is also the matter of a ring camera positioned approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's home. Footage from that camera captured a vehicle moving through the area at 2:36 in the morning on February 1st, close to the same time frame as the last recorded sync between Nancy's pacemaker and her iPhone. Nanos confirmed investigators are aware of that footage and examining it alongside hundreds of thousands of vehicles captured across the full surveillance window. The car has not yet been identified. Coffindaffer described it as a concerning open thread. Not a closed lead, but a lead that has not yet produced an answer. And then there is the prior visit. A BC News, citing multiple sources familiar with the investigation, reported that the masked suspect appears to have visited Nancy Guthrie's front door at least once before the night she was taken. One of the FBI's released images, specifically the image showing the suspect without the backpack, was captured on a prior date. Sources told ABC News that one working theory is that the suspect came to the door on that first occasion, spotted the doorbell camera, and retreated, then returned on February 1st, either believing he had already neutralized it or prepared to deal with it on the spot. That prior visit is precisely why investigators asked Nancy's neighbors to submit all available surveillance footage going back to January 1st, a full month before the night of the abduction. They were not just looking for February 1st, they were looking for the preparation, the reconnaissance, the dry run. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack told ABC News that if this is the same individual returning after an earlier visit, it points to someone who was actively surveilling the property in advance, adding that the level of preparation and planning involved makes this a more sophisticated criminal operation than someone acting impulsively. And that sophistication, combined with what? Investigators believe the suspect knew about this property before he ever set foot on it. Is what leads directly to the most critical question in this entire investigation. Who is this person? And how did he know what he knew? This is the part of the documentary where the evidence stops being about what happened and starts being about who did it. Because everything recovered, everything analyzed, everything confirmed across 34 days of one of the most resource-intensive true crime investigations in recent American history points toward a single, unavoidable conclusion. Whoever took Nancy Guthrie knew her, not necessarily personally, not necessarily closely, but they knew enough. And that level of knowledge does not come from passing a house on a road you ended up on by accident. Steve Moore is a retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent who contributed the analysis to CNN throughout this investigation. He made a geographic observation that is easy to underestimate but impossible to dismiss. Once you hear it, Nancy Street, he said, is not a thoroughfare, is not a road people drive through on their way somewhere else. If you went into that neighborhood, you meant to go to that neighborhood. The Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, are not a cut-through. They are a destination, which means the pool of people who had any legitimate reason to be on that street is finite. It is unknowable. And investigators would have compiled that list from day one. What remains after every resident and every regular visitor is accounted for is the territory where the answer lives. Jennifer Coffindaffer, the former FBI intelligence analyst, told Newsweek that her assessment of the suspect goes beyond a stranger who selected a target randomly. Her words were direct. That means that either family, someone who worked in her employ, a pool technician, a housekeeper, someone who handled maintenance, somebody who was close to her, perhaps even a friend or associate. Forensic analyst Joseph. Scott Morgan, contributing analysis to News Nation, framed the same idea from a different angle. He raised the specific possibility that whoever took Nancy had advanced knowledge of who her daughter was, because that knowledge, knowing that the woman in that house is the mother of one of the most visible television personalities in the country, is precisely what makes an 84-year-old woman living alone in the desert a high-value target worth the calculated risk of this operation. Think about what that means. This was not opportunistic. This was not someone who stumbled onto a vulnerable target. This was someone who understood the value of what they were taking, and that understanding had to come from somewhere. Retired NYPD officer Marlon Stanton described the suspect as someone tangential to Nancy's life. His examples were specific and deliberate. People like social acquaintances, service workers, community connections, people who existed on the edges of her daily world and close. Enough to learn the details, far enough to avoid immediate suspicion, and the details they appear to have known are stacking up. They knew the layout of the property. They knew where the doorbell camera was positioned. Jim Clemente noted in his profiler analysis that in the footage, the suspect moves toward the camera with his head already angled down, moving toward it directly. Jennifer Coffindaffer's response to that detail was immediate. They knew exactly where that camera was, she told Newsweek. That is not the behavior of someone encountering it for the first time. They knew Nancy was alone that night. In a home set back on an acre-plus lot in the Catalina foothills, surrounded by cactus and dense desert foliage, well off the road, far enough from neighboring properties that a disturbance in the early morning hours would never be audible to anyone nearby. Jennifer Coffindaffer described the layout plainly. Acre to 3 acre plots with the house set deep into the property, behind substantial natural cover. Whoever chose this location understood what that isolation meant operationally. And then there is the detail that has not received nearly enough attention in the broader true crime conversation around this case. Nancy's dog passed away in December 2025, approximately 6 weeks before she was taken. That dog was a living alarm system. an animal capable of alerting to an intruder, creating noise, drawing attention, complicating an operation that depended entirely on silence and control. And 6 weeks before the abduction, it was gone. The question investigators are working through is straightforward and unsettling. Did the suspect know that? Was the absence of that dog a variable they had already accounted for in their planning? Because if it was, if they knew the dog was gone before they came back on February 1st, that tells you something specific about the timeline of their surveillance and the depth of their knowledge about Nancy's daily life. Former FBI Supervisory Special Agent Jason Pack noted that the level of preparation and reconnaissance visible in this case is consistent with someone who spent meaningful time learning this target before moving on her. That kind of preparation does not happen overnight. It builds over weeks, possibly months, and it requires access, either physical, social, or both, to information that a stranger simply would not have. Now let's talk about the criminal profile that has emerged from the footage and the forensic picture combined. Jim Clemente's assessment places the suspect most likely in his 30s or 40s, motivated enough to plan and execute a kidnapping operation against a specific target in a specific location, but not a professional. The improvised response at the camera, grabbing nearby brush in a moment of unplanned panic, is not the behavior of someone who has executed operations like this at a high level before. His failure to cover his mouth for 41 minutes inside an enclosed space is not the behavior of someone with sophisticated forensic awareness. His apparent surprise at finding the doorbell camera actively recording him is not consistent with someone who has done this repeatedly and cleanly. He planned carefully up to a point, and then the reality of the moment pushed past the edge of his preparation, and in that gap laid in those unplanned seconds of reaction, he left behind the evidence that Clemente believes will ultimately identify him. This case will be solved, Clemente said, without qualification, without hedging, because of what that footage captured and because of what 41 unmasked minutes inside a closed residential space forensically means. Over 14,000 tips have been submitted to this investigation. According to ABC News, more than 750 of those have been deemed credible by investigators and are being worked through systematically. The answer to who did this is somewhere inside that pool of information. It is being narrowed. It is being cross-referenced against the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage, the genealogical DNA analysis, the geographic profile, and the physical identifier, that marking on the inner right wrist, that the suspect left behind in the moment he panicked. But knowing who took Nancy Guthrie is only half of what this investigation needs to answer. The other half is where she is now. And that question leads directly into the geography of this case, and into a set of investigative protocols that tell a very specific story about what law enforcement actually believes happened after February 1st. Here's something that does not show up in most of the true crime coverage surrounding this case. And it should. Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona, sits approximately 60 miles from the United States-Mexico border. 60 miles. In a vehicle moving at highway speed, in the early morning hours when traffic is minimal, that is less than an hour. Less than an hour between that front porch in the Catalina foothills and an international border crossing into Mexican territory. That geographic reality is not a footnote in this investigation. It is a central variable that shaped the direction of the federal response from the very first days. On day 9 of this investigation, the first person detained for questioning was stopped by law enforcement in Rio Rico, Arizona, approximately 60 miles south of Tucson, near a border crossing. That individual was a delivery driver. He was released without charges. He told CNN's local affiliate that he may have delivered a package to the Guthrie home but had nothing to do with the abduction. He was cleared. But the location of that initial detention is not incidental. It tells you where investigators were already looking by day 9. Not in Tucson. 60 miles south of Tucson, near the border. TMZ, citing sources, reported that FBI agents had made contact with Mexican authorities regarding the possibility that Nancy had been transported across the border. Former FBI and CIA Officer Tracy Walder, contributing analysis to News Nation, stated that given the geography, 60 miles to a crossing point, a case involving a possible ransom motive and no domestic recovery, investigators would have begun treating cross-border movement as an active scenario within the first 72 hours of the disappearance. Mexican authorities from the state of Sonora subsequently confirmed to News Nation that communication had been established with the FBI. At that point in the investigation, the FBI informed them that no specific leads were actively pointing towards Sonoran territory. But here's what matters. And this distinction is critical to understanding what that contact actually signals. Border coordination protocols and missing persons investigations are not activated for recovery operations. They are not activated when investigators are operating under the assumption that a case has already reached its conclusion. They are activated when investigators are working under the presumption that the subject is alive and may have been physically moved across an international boundary. That is a living person protocol. It was used here, on a specific timeline, in a specific direction. Now layer the federal legal framework on top of that geography. Federal Statute 18, United States Code, Section 1201, the Federal Kidnapping Law, contains a provision that activated automatically when Nancy was not released within 24 hours of her disappearance. The statute states that the failure to release the victim within 24 hours creates a legal presumption that the individual has been transported in interstate or foreign commerce. That presumption gave the FBI federal jurisdiction on day 2 of this investigation. But jurisdiction and an active federal kidnapping prosecution being constructed are not the same thing. Jennifer Coffindaffer is precise on this distinction. The FBI receives jurisdiction automatically from the statute. That is procedural. Federal prosecutors physically appearing at a crime scene is an entirely separate signal. It means someone inside the federal system has made a determination that there is a prosecutable case worth constructing. And the most serious federal kidnapping charges under the most serious provisions of that statute are built around a living hostage. Not around a recovery, not around a forensic audit of remains, but around a living person being held. Pima County Attorney's Office confirmed that prosecutors from both the county level and the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona were working alongside the Sheriff's Department and the FBI at the scene. Coffindaffer's response to that detail was immediate and unambiguous. Federal prosecutors do not show up at crime scenes routinely. When they do, it means something specific about the direction the case is being built. The United States Attorney for the District of Arizona released a public statement that deserves close reading in the context of everything this documentary has covered. He said his office would go anywhere, do anything, and persevere always to find her. Not find answers, not find what happened, not determine an outcome, find her. Present tense, living person language, from the chief federal prosecutor overseeing the legal architecture of this entire investigation. Words chosen by federal prosecutors in active cases are not accidental. They are deliberate. And the word choice there, find her, is the language of someone operating under the presumption that there is a living person to be located. Now here's where the geography, the federal framework, and the forensic picture all converge on the single most significant and least discussed piece of evidence in this entire case. Nancy Guthrie has an implanted pacemaker. That device last synced with her iPhone in the early morning hours of February 1st, close to the same time frame as the vehicle captured on a Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from her home. Investigators worked directly with the pacemaker manufacturer to access the internal data stored on that device. Data that, depending on the specific device model, can record cardiac events beyond the last sync point, activity that occurs after the phone connection drops, information about what the heart was doing after the last digital timestamp. What that data contains has not been disclosed. It is classified. It sits inside the investigation, inside the briefing files that Chris Nanos has reviewed in full. The people who have seen it have not described it publicly. No journalist has reported its contents. No former agent or analyst commenting on this case from the outside has had access to it. Chris Nanos has reviewed it, and Chris Nanos looked into a national news camera on day 31 and said he believes Nancy Guthrie is alive. That data point, that classified pacemaker readout sitting in a federal briefing file in Tucson, Arizona, is the piece of this puzzle that every outside expert, every true crime analyst, every former law enforcement official commenting from the exterior of this investigation has been working without. Michael Gould has not seen it. Elizabeth Smart has not seen it. The journalists covering this case daily have not seen it. The 16 million people who watch the story unfold across American news coverage have not seen it. One man has seen it and told the country what he believes it shows. That is not a small thing. That is the entire ballgame. And it leads directly to the final question this documentary has been building towards since the first second. After 34 days, after everything confirmed and everything still classified, after the task force and the door-to-door sweeps and the federal prosecutors and the border contacts and the 14,000 tips and the DNA that is not yet finished processing, what does the complete picture actually show? Not what the outside experts see, not what the statistics say, but the full mosaic, every tile classified and public assembled together, actually looks like. That is where this ends. This is where everything comes together. Not as a comfort, not as a conclusion that wraps the story into something clean and resolved, but as an honest accounting of what 34 days of one of the most intensively resourced true crime investigations in recent American history has actually produced, assembled without editorializing, without hope, and without despair, because both things are true simultaneously, and holding both of them is the only intellectually honest place to stand. The statistics are real. The medical vulnerability is real. The elapsed time is real. Michael Gould's credentials are genuine. Elizabeth Smart's experience is unimpeachable. The documented record of what typically happens in adult abduction cases after 72 hours is not invented, and it is not exaggerated. Every outside expert who has analyzed the publicly available evidence in this case and reached a grim conclusion did so responsibly and transparently. Their picture of this case is serious, built by serious professionals, and it cannot be dismissed. But here's what every single one of those professionals was working without. They have not seen the pacemaker data. They were not in the classified FBI briefings. They have not reviewed the complete forensic DNA results recovered from inside Nancy's home. They have not seen the surveillance footage that has never been released to the public. Their picture of this case, as serious and as credible as it is built from the tiles that the rest of us have access to. Nothing more. Chris Nanos has seen all of it. Every classified result, every unreleased frame of footage, every forensic report that has not left the building, the complete picture, the full mosaic, every tile that exists in the public and classified, assembled together into a single evidentiary portrait of what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and where this investigation currently stands. And having seen all of it, in full with nothing withheld, he chose to sit down in front of a national news camera on day 31 and say out loud that he personally believes Nancy Guthrie is alive, that his investigators are working under the official presumption that she is living, that they are definitely closer. That is not a throwaway line. That is not institutional pressure to maintain public engagement with the tip line. That is not a grieving family member refusing to let go. That is the law enforcement official legally and professionally responsible for this investigation. A man whose career and credibility are directly attached to every public word he speaks, telling the country what the complete evidence picture shows. Now let's assemble everything this documentary has covered into a single factual record, a formal joint FBI and PEMA. County Task Force has been activated, 4 detectives and a sergeant physically relocated into the FBI's Tucson field office to work this case and nothing else. On day 33, FBI agents returned to the Catalina foothills for renewed door-to-door canvassing, not a press statement, not a ceremonial gesture, agents on foot in the same streets they had already walked. Federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office physically appeared at the crime scene, something a 30-year FBI veteran described as a signal that a federal case is actively being constructed. The U.S. Attorney released a public statement using present tense, living person language that his office would find her. Border coordination and international contacts were established with Mexican federal authorities, protocols that are not activated for recovery operations, but for living person investigations. A classified pacemaker dataset exists, reviewed by the sheriff, never disclosed publicly. A forensic DNA sample recovered from inside Nancy's home is currently being processed and is potentially eligible for investigative genetic genealogy, the same technique that has resolved decades-old cold cases across this country. A physical identifier, a marking on the inner right wrist of the suspect, is visible in the doorbell footage and available for cross-reference in any suspect comparison. More than 750 credible tips out of 14,000 submitted are being worked through systematically. And after 34 days of professional FBI canvassing, law enforcement terrain, sweeps, forensic walkthroughs, and coordinated volunteer searches across the desert terrain surrounding Tucson, no remains have been found, no body, no physical trace of Nancy Guthrie beyond the interior of her home, and the blood confirmed on her front porch. That last point carries weight that tends to get buried under the statistical consensus. The absence of remains after 34 days of intensive searching in a defined geographic area is not a neutral data point. In cases where an abduction victim did not survive, investigators typically locate physical evidence of that outcome within the search perimeter relatively early in the process. After 34 days of professional and volunteer searches, including the involvement of Madres Buscadoras de Sonora, a Mexican nonprofit with an established record of locating human remains in exactly this kind of desert terrain, nothing has been found. That is a fact. It is on the record, and it matters. The combined reward in this case currently stands at $1.1 million. $1 million from the Guthrie family, $100,000 from the FBI. Anonymous tips are accepted through the FBI's tip line. No name required, no identity disclosed, just information. And information is exactly what this investigation still needs, because the person who did this is not a ghost. They exist. They live somewhere, they work somewhere, they interact with people, and somewhere in their behavior around late January and early February of this year, something changed, something shifted, someone noticed. A coworker who suddenly missed days, a neighbor whose routine changed abruptly, a family member who became withdrawn or evasive, someone who seemed to know details about this case that had not been reported publicly, someone with a marking on the inside of their right wrist, someone who knew Nancy Guthrie was alone, someone who knew her dog was gone, someone who had been to that door before. Retired NYPD Detective Mike Saprio told Fox News Digital that criminals who operate in communities like the Catalina foothills do their homework. They identify patterns, they learn routines, they map vulnerabilities over time. And individuals living alone, regardless of the value of the property, regardless of the quiet culture of the neighborhood, represent exactly the kind of target that a calculated, patient, motivated individual will eventually move on. That conversation about the 16 million Americans over the age of 65 currently living alone in this country, nearly triple the number that lived alone in 1950, is a conversation this country needs to have, not as a verdict against any one family, not as an assignment of blame to anyone other than the person who planned and executed this crime, but as an honest national reckoning with what it means when millions of older Americans are aging independently in communities that are being studied by people who mean them harm. The criminal in this case is whoever disabled those floodlights, whoever mapped that property, whoever came to that door in the early morning hours of February 1st with a mask and a plan and took an 84-year-old woman from her home. The verdict for what happened to Nancy belongs with whoever did that, and with the jury that will one day sit in a federal courtroom and hear the case that prosecutors are already building, because they are building it. The task force is working, the DNA is processing, the tips are being cross-referenced, the genealogical profile is being constructed, the footage is still being analyzed, and the man who has seen everything that exists in this investigation looked into a camera and said his team is definitely closer. Day 34. The investigation is active. The tip lines are open, the search is ongoing, and somewhere out there, in a city, in a neighborhood, at a job, in a house, someone knows something. Maybe they know everything. Maybe they only know one detail that they have convinced themselves is not important enough to report. But in an investigation with 14,000 tips and 750 credible leads being worked simultaneously, one detail from the right persons is all it takes to move the entire picture. If you know someone whose behavior changed suddenly around late January or early February, someone who disappeared, cut ties abruptly, or missed work without a clear explanation, someone who seemed to know more about this case than what the news had reported, someone who had any reason to know who Nancy Guthrie was, where she lived, that she was alone, or that her dog was no longer there, someone with a marking on the inside of their right wrist, the FBI wants to hear from you, anonymously, right now, because somebody out there knows where she is, and the only thing standing between that person and the answer that 34 days of one of the most intensive true crime investigations in recent American history has not yet produced is a phone call.